Hello, listeners. The MCP has returned to our original 2 episodes per month schedule. However, 1 episode is now exclusively for patrons of the MCP. Please make sure to switch into the new Patreon tiers so you receive your extra episodes. The price has not changed per episode, you'll just receive 2 episodes. The rewards currently remain the same, but it's likely some changes will be made in the future. A huge thank you to all of you for your support. I wouldn't be able to keep this podcast going without you, the creepy community. Thank you so much. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Last year, I spent 2 months abroad in England, visiting family, sightseeing, and working on several episodes for the MCP. Sometimes a new environment aids in inspiration and motivation, and that was definitely the case with this trip. During those 2 months, I visited several locations in England that I felt would make excellent topics for the first few patron-only episodes. One of those locations was Highgate Cemetery, one of the largest cemeteries in England, complete with tales of ghosts and vampires wandering the gravestones. The Cemetery of St. James at Highgate, known by most as Highgate Cemetery, is an expansive cemetery that was consecrated and opened for interments in 1839, just after the crowning of Queen Victoria. Highgate Cemetery holds around 53,000 graves, with 170,000 individual burials contained in them. The catacombs of Highgate contain 825 individuals, and there are 16 vaults in the cemetery as well. In its heyday, it was a magnificent place that Victorians flocked to, both to display their wealth through monuments and funerals, and to celebrate their deceased loved ones. It's still a working cemetery today, but from the 1930s to the 1970s, it fell into decline and then disrepair. It became overgrown with ivy, bushes, and trees, and a haunt of tramps and mischievous adolescents. Today, the cemetery is recovering from this period of abandonment thanks to the Friends of Highgate Cemetery, who took over care for the cemetery in 1975. The Friends have conserved and restored many graves and footpaths and offer paid tours to raise funds for maintaining the cemetery. Highgate receives around 99,000 visitors a year. Before the 19th century, most burials took place in Anglican cemeteries and churchyards. However, by the 1820s, most cemeteries within the City of London were becoming overcrowded and unsanitary. Birth rates and mortality rates were rising thanks to the Industrial Revolution, which spurred an influx of people into the city looking for work. The population doubled in 40 years to 2 million by 1841. By that year, London had a daily death rate of 125 people. That's over 45,000 a year. The cemeteries at the time couldn't take the increased load. Because of the lack of space, bodies were being added to older graves. Coffins were stacked up so high in the graves that the last coffin was sometimes only inches from the surface. Coffins were often made of wood, which was unable to contain the liquids produced by decay. The smell must have been horrific. Newspapers published reports about how disgusting it was to go to a funeral or visit a deceased family member. In his book, Dirty Old London, Lee Jackson describes the scene. Quote, "Putrefying bodies were frequently disturbed, dismembered, or destroyed to make room for newcomers. Disinterred bones, dropped by neglectful gravediggers, lay scattered amidst the tombstones. Smashed coffins were sold to the poor for firewood, end quote. And yet these cemeteries kept accepting bodies, as burial fees were what paid the bills. In 1831, London suffered from its first cholera epidemic. Miasma, or bad air from the bursting cemeteries, was blamed for the cholera epidemic and later episodes of typhoid. George Alfred Walker, nicknamed Graveyard Walker, studied the so-called miasma, which was actually gases created by the putrefaction of corpses. Such gases can cause illness, though not cholera or typhoid. Walker reported that the worst church guilty of continuing to accept corpses was Enon Chapel in the slum near the Strand. Thousands of corpses were kept in its cellar, none in lead coffins. Insects from the corpses came up through the floors, along with, quote, cadaverous vapors, end quote, during church services. When the cellar got too full, some of the remains were dumped in the sewer just outside the church. Another issue at the time was body snatching. Body snatchers, also called resurrectionists in the UK, were commonly employed by anatomists during the 18th and 19th centuries to exhume the bodies of the recently dead from cemeteries to be dissected at universities. The fast-rising study of anatomy required many bodies to dissect, but all that were legally available to them were the bodies of executed criminals. This supply was far below demand, and as corpses legally belonged to no one at the time, stealing them wasn't a crime. However, it horrified the public. Higher walls, deeper graves, and cemetery guards were in demand to deter resurrection men. If you want to hear more about corpse theft, listen to our episode about it with expert Dr. Jenna Dittmar. Along with an impressive and secure wall, middle and upper-class Victorians valued beauty in the memorialization of their dead, as well as imposing monuments. An entire culture had developed surrounding death and mourning, which included lavish funerals, large monuments, and sometimes months of mourning. We covered this topic in more detail in our Victorian death photography episode if you're interested. In summary, the Victorians, especially wealthy Victorians, wanted their dead to be beautifully memorialized. Therefore, beautiful and well-maintained garden cemeteries with rolling hills, flowers, and places for mourners to sit became highly desirable. The very first of this type of garden cemetery was Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which was constructed in 1804 and was already renowned for its beauty by the time Highgate Cemetery was being planned. Most garden cemeteries built after Père Lachaise emulated it, and Highgate was no exception. Highgate Cemetery was one of the earliest privately run garden cemeteries in England. It was one of 8 private cemeteries constructed in the 1830s and early 1840s in an attempt to solve the overcrowding problem. These 8 cemeteries were called the Magnificent Seven. The 8th, Victoria Park Cemetery, was forgotten for a time as it closed to burials in 1876, then reopened in 1894 as a public park called Meath Gardens. The other 6 cemeteries in the Magnificent Seven are Kensal Green, West Norwood, Brompton, Tower Hamlets, Abney Park, and Nunhead. Highgate was the first project of the London Cemetery Company and was established with an Act of Parliament in 1836, along with several other outer city cemeteries. Stephen Geary, who designed the King's Cross Monument, for which the massive train station and an area of London is named, founded the London Cemetery Company. Geary was more of an entrepreneur than an architect and saw Highgate as a business venture. He wanted to build a cemetery that could beat out the competition of the other new garden cemeteries. The land set aside for Highgate Cemetery took up some of the grounds of Ashurst House, a house that had been built for Sir William Ashurst, Mayor of London in 1694. At the time Highgate was constructed, the house had already been torn down and replaced with St. Michael's Church in 1832. The grounds were officially consecrated to safeguard the sacred use of the land in perpetuity. The area was hilly, with good views of London. It was then landscaped to seem even larger, using winding roads to ascend to the top of the hill. Both footpaths and wide carriage roads were installed. 2 chapels were built, one for Church of England funerals and the other for dissenters, meaning any other religion besides the Church of England, but generally referring to Protestants. An imposing archway between the two chapels served as the entrance to the cemetery. The chapels and entryway were built in the Tudor Gothic style and topped with turrets and a bell tower. To keep out body snatchers, the cemetery was well guarded by high walls and a small armed force of retired soldiers day and night. This original part of Highgate is called the West Cemetery today, as it sits on the west side of Swains Lane, a narrow and very steep road that passes the cemetery entrance. The first burial occurred on May 26, 1839, 6 days after Highgate Cemetery opened. In its first year, 212 burials occurred there, the average age of the deceased being 33. That average was low because a quarter of them were under age 5. In 1854, the cemetery proved to be so profitable and popular that it was extended by 20 acres in an area just on the other side of Swains Lane. This new ground is now known as the East Cemetery, and it opened for burials in 1856. A tunnel beneath the road connected the two burial grounds. A hydraulic lift was built to aid in moving coffins from the chapels in the West Cemetery down to the tunnel and under the road. This kept the coffin within consecrated ground throughout its journey, as the road was not considered consecrated. The types of memorials found in both the West and East Cemetery vary. The West has more monumental architecture, such as mausolea, catacombs, vaults, columbariums, obelisks, chest tombs, and sarcophagi. As I mentioned, the West Cemetery is the older part of Highgate Cemetery. Through the gate, past the archway and chapels, is a wide circular courtyard backed by a colonnade made up of 15 stone arches. The courtyard had to be wide enough for carriages to enter and turn around. The colonnade both retains and grants access to the higher ground behind it, and also provides a dramatic route to the 17 acres of graves beyond. The main path from the colonnade runs northwest and is lined with large monuments. Eventually, the main road goes through an archway decorated with imposing obelisks and lotus columns reflected of Egyptian architecture. Through the arch is a series of vaults, which used to have a roof, but is now open to the air and covered in ivy. This feature is called Egyptian Avenue. It was built during the Egyptomania that spread across Europe after Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt at the end of the 18th century. In the cemetery's 1865 guidebook, it was described as a cold, stony death palace. There are 16 vaults in Egyptian Avenue, each privately owned by a single family. The heavy cast iron doors of the vaults are decorated with inverted torches, a symbol of extinguished life. Each vault can fit 12 individual coffins, but none are currently full. At the end of Egyptian Avenue is a circle of vaults surrounding a cedar of Lebanon tree. This area is called the Circle of Lebanon. The tree was part of the Ashurst estate before the cemetery was built, and the circle of vaults was carefully excavated and constructed around it. Unfortunately, the tree died recently, but a new one of the same species has been planted in its place. There are 20 vaults around the tree's roots, each with 2 iron doors. The decoration is again Egyptian-inspired. A continuous cornice along the top links the vaults together to form one structure. An outer circle of vaults was constructed 40 years after the first, adding 16 more vaults, which face the original 20. The outer vaults are in the classic Greek style and can hold 15 coffins each. One of these vaults became a columbarium, in which cremated remains are placed. Just up the road from this sunken circle of vaults, at the highest point in the cemetery, are the terrace catacombs, built where the terrace of Ashurst House used to be. Finished in 1842, the Gothic-style catacombs contain 825 recesses, or loculi, from floor to ceiling on both sides of an 80-yard structure. These loculi are held in 55 numbered bays, with 15 loculi each. Each loculi is designed to hold one coffin. Most are sealed shut, with an inscribed slab or small glass inspection window, so mourners could check the coffin was still intact and hadn't been robbed. The entire catacomb is lit with skylights. Adjacent to the catacombs is the Beer Mausoleum belonging to Julius Beer, a London stockbroker. Beer, along with his wife, son, and brother, are all interred inside. A life-size sculpture of Beer's daughter, Ada, in the arms of an angel, is housed inside. Ada died of scarlet fever at age 8. While all the West Cemetery was originally beautifully maintained and landscaped, today it's mostly concealed by foliage from the trees and shrubs that took over the cemetery during its time of abandonment. Any view of the city is completely obscured, and ivy hides much of the once grand architecture. The footpaths are overgrown, and wildlife scurry freely amongst the headstones and footpaths. In 1852, there was a ban on burials in central London in attempt to deal with the overflowing cemeteries. This made plots at Highgate, which was just outside the city at the time, even more in demand. Highgate's East Cemetery opened for burials in 1860, essentially doubling the size of the cemetery. At this point, there were over 10,400 graves in the West Cemetery already, after only 21 years in operation. During the 1860s, there was an average of 30 burials a day at Highgate. The East Cemetery was designed to accommodate as many burials as possible. Because of this, there aren't as many grandiose monuments as the West Cemetery, and some common graves were placed under some of the footpaths. Most graves are single plots with simple headstones. After 1914, 3 mausolea were added. More sculptural headstones were also added later. One of the most famous graves at Highgate, that of Karl Marx, is in the East Cemetery. Marx, the German philosopher, economist, and revolutionary socialist, was originally buried in 1883 in his wife's grave on a small side path. In 1954, however, the Communist Party, which originated from his works, launched the Marx Memorial Fund to exhume both bodies and move them to a more prominent location on the main path. The old headstone was incorporated into a new pedestal. The final lines of Marx's 1848 work, the Communist Manifesto, were carved into the pedestal. Quote, "Workers of all lands, unite." End quote. 2 years later, a larger-than-life bust of Marx was added. Marx's grave is the most visited monument at Highgate. By the early 1900s, Highgate Cemetery was full, and there were already complaints that it wasn't being maintained. The Victorian desire for elaborate funerals had faded, and families began to favor less ostentatious memorials. At the outbreak of the Great War, also known as World War I, many of the cemetery's 40 or so gardeners and groundskeepers were called up to fight. Despite this diminished workforce, the grounds continued to be kept in immaculate order. Conditions seriously deteriorated during World War II, and when a German bomb damaged some of the vaults, many were just left opened or covered with tarpaulins. Although some wealthy families continued to purchase plots in the 1930s, Highgate Cemetery was in decline. Less expensive plots and more common graves became the more desirable options. Increasingly, greater numbers of graves were abandoned as families died out or moved away. Maintenance faded to a minimum. Nature began to take back the land. Trees, ivy, and shrubs grew up between the memorials, and animals found homes among them, such as foxes, hedgehogs, and bats. In 1956, in order to raise much-needed income, the cemetery sold off its stonemason's yard, along with the superintendent's house. The 2 chapels were also closed the same year. The London Cemetery Company declared bankruptcy in 1960 and was quickly absorbed into the United Cemetery Company, which struggled to keep Highgate running for another 15 years. Funds eventually ran out and the gates were closed. By the mid-1960s, Highgate was notorious for its ruination. The creepy, overgrown cemetery gripped the imaginations of many. The area around it, which had once been quite affluent, was also starting to decline due to bouts of gang violence, an influx of drugs, and the resulting child neglect and abuse. Swains Lane soon developed the nickname Lover's Lane. Couples would meet up and find seclusion in the cemetery. By 1970, the cemetery gate was so dilapidated that teens could freely come and go as they pleased, with many hanging out amongst the graves after dark. Tramps and schoolboys were reported for climbing on graves for a dare. The families of the deceased felt uncomfortable visiting the graves as the area was so overgrown, and because they would be followed around by tramps. Also during the 1970s, Highgate was rumored to be the home of a vampire. Reports of supernatural activity at the cemetery had become common since maintenance ended, but the many reports of a single vampiric entity were so prevalent that it caused a media sensation. The most thorough account of the Highgate vampire was published in 1993 by folklorist Bill Ellis. European interest and fear of magic and occultism is deeply ingrained. The history of this fascination is a little muddled, however, it has had a large effect on European history. One example is the blood libel accusations against religious and ethnic groups that began during the Roman era and were repeated on several occasions throughout history. We touched on this topic in our episode about golems. Another example is the witch hunting hysteria that occurred multiple times between 1350 and 1740, which we also touched on in our Lancashire witch trials episode. In the early 19th century, these magic and occult accusations were directed at the Freemasons, the male-only organization with origins in 13th century stonemason guilds that were and still are secretive about their rituals, symbols, and handshakes. While the Masons are generally a liberal moral brotherhood, due to their secrecy, esoteric rites, and anti-clerical sentiments, much conspiracy and fear has been directed at their organization over the years. A series of grave desecrations in the early 1960s caused more panic. The most notorious incident occurred in Clophill, Bedfordshire, at the Church of St. Mary's. At this location, the same grave and female corpse was desecrated several times, sparking fear of satanic rites. It also brought morbidly curious visitors, which unfortunately sparked copycat desecrations all over England. Let me know if you want a whole episode on the Black Mass of St. Mary's. The newspapers blamed Satanists for the cemetery desecrations, despite teens insisting that they were just morbid pranks. This panic, combined with the already spooky reputation of Highgate, culminated in a very public search for the supernatural and a feud between amateur investigators. Sometime in the mid-1960s, the British Occult Society formed. It was a group of youths including David Farrant and Sean Manchester, who were interested in the supernatural. The group had a habit of visiting Highgate at night in 1966 and 67, partly out of interest in the supernatural, but also for a laugh and to frighten each other. It was mostly harmless, but also resulted in vandalism. The vandalism, not just perpetrated by the British Occult Society, got worse, with vaults being broken into, coffins being smashed and set alight, and corpses being pulled out onto the paths and left there. Sometime between December 21st and 24th in 1969, whilst in the cemetery at night, David Farrant said he saw a tall grey man with glowing eyes wandering the cemetery. He reported being paralyzed due to psychic attack. The British Occult Society was intrigued and wanted to investigate further, so they wrote the local newspaper asking for other experiences at Highgate. Many reports followed, mostly describing a similar tall man in a hat who hypnotized or paralyzed those who saw him. Reports continued to come in until around March 1970. Sean Manchester believed the Grey Man was a vampire. A rivalry quickly developed between David Farrant and Sean Manchester, each claiming they could expel the creature. Manchester broke from the British Occult Society and started his own paranormal society. He reported that he had seen many fox and other large animal corpses in the cemetery over the years, all drained of blood. He feared it was the work of a king vampire from Wallachia, brought to England by coffin in the 18th century. If you've ever read Dracula, this story may sound familiar. On August 1st, 1970, the charred and headless remains of a woman was found not far from the terrace catacombs. Satanic rites were again suspected. Later that month, David Farrant was found by police near the cemetery carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. Manchester was found in the cemetery, having forced open a family vault, which he claimed was pointed out by a psychic as the lair of the vampire. He planned to stake it, but instead left garlic inside the vault. This rivalry continued for several years. The public was very interested in what was going on between Farrant and Manchester. The television channel ITV broadcast an interview with Farrant on Friday the 13th of April, 1973. Standing in front of the cemetery gate, Farrant accused Manchester of threatening him with black magic. 2 hours after the broadcast aired, a crowd of would-be vampire hunters and onlookers formed at the cemetery gates, hoping for a duel between the two men. Many got into the cemetery, despite police presence. Eventually, the crowd dispersed, annoyed that Manchester hadn't even been there. After the night of the interview, more incidents of vandalism occurred at Highgate. Fear of satanic cult rose as well when several teenage girls found a charred corpse on one of the footpaths in the cemetery. Similar stories circulated. A young girl was attacked and thrown to the ground on Swains Lane during the early hours of the morning. The shadowy attacker vanished over the 12-foot cemetery wall as a car stopped to help her. In 1974, a dog walker returned to his car parked on Swains Lane to find a freshly exhumed corpse inside the vehicle. Police presence near Highgate grew. Many adolescent vandals were caught. Farrant was arrested and jailed in 1974 for damaging memorials and interfering with human remains. He believed Satanists had vandalized the graves, and he was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. From September 1979, Great Britain was gripped with concern about secret satanic cults. The fear was further fueled in 1980 when 20 children were removed from their parents who were suspected of ritually abusing them as part of devil worship. A similar incident occurred in 1981. The cases of abuse were real enough, but the link to Satanism was quite weak and mostly sensationalism on the part of the media. These incidents inspired a book published in the US, which claimed to be a true account of a survivor of satanic abuse. While no such accounts preceded the book, hundreds followed it. An all-out witch hunt for Satanists began, called the Satanic Panic. That panic soon spread back to England in the late 1980s, but petered out in the 1990s. Both Farrant and Manchester continued to speak and write about the Highgate vampire. Their feud continued until Farrant's death in April of 2019. His third wife, Della Farrant, has now written a book about Highgate Cemetery. Highgate is still rumored to be haunted today. Even Google Maps describes it as a reputedly haunted historic graveyard. While spurring vandalism and hoaxes, the attention brought awareness to the ruined state of the cemetery. In 1975, the Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust formed in order to restore and maintain the historic cemetery. After 15 years of fundraising and restoration work, the cemetery reopened to the public in 1990 for both burials and tours. The fee charged for tours goes to the trust to help maintain the cemetery. Graves are now safer, many have been restored, and the ivy, ash, and sycamore trees have been tamed somewhat. The cemetery is still an active burial ground today, with up to 90 interments and 50 plots purchased a year. It's also a nature conservation site, as a rare and unique orb weaver spider, scientific name Meta borneti, was found in the vaults of Egyptian Avenue. Anyone can visit, and the price of admission, as well as donations and burials, are what keep it open. There are many famous historical people buried at Highgate. Michael Faraday, the well-known chemist and physicist; Dr. Henry Gray, the anatomist and surgeon who authored Gray's Anatomy; Scottish surgeon Robert Lisson, also known as the fastest knife in the West End after his reputation for speedy amputations; and George Eliot, which is the pen name of novelist Mary Ann Evans. More recent interments include Douglas Adams, author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Ian Holm, the much-loved English actor, and George Michael, the famous pop singer. Highgate has been featured in several films, one of the more recent ones being Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald. The overgrown appearance of Highgate Cemetery and its signature vaults have also inspired scenery in literature, cinema, and video games. Author Neil Gaiman stated in the acknowledgments of The Graveyard Book that Highgate was the inspiration for the setting of his story. Having visited Highgate, I now understand why it's inspired so much folklore and fiction. The whole place has a tangible atmosphere. There is so much foliage growing around the memorials that you can't help but see life right alongside death. Thanks to the trees and overgrowth, especially in the West Cemetery, it was around 5 degrees cooler than the rest of London. There was also a feeling of closeness that wouldn't have existed when it was first built, as the trees were not originally there. Walking the footpaths was like being hugged by a friendly Gothic story. I don't know how else to describe it. Yes, death was ever present, as was a feeling of abandonment thanks to the overgrowth, but there was also peace, care in the way the memorials were restored, and a sort of inviting gloom. It was like being inside a secret garden, sepia tones and green, wet earth, stone, alone but surrounded by people, by stories. I felt right at home. It's this atmosphere and the history of the place that makes Highgate Cemetery draw out our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and on social media. And please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture, featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP, you can give one-time donations on our website. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a list of episodes, and our mailing address. We also have an Amazon wishlist at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.